Hi, we continue today in this amazing second scene of our story in Genesis 16, where Hagar becomes Abraham on the one hand and Moses on the other. So we began this chapter looking at old and new ways to engage the story, and we saw how older ways tended to scapegoat Hagar and praise Sarai, if not praise her altogether, but ending up scapegoating Hagar and her children, starting with Ishmael, in a variety of ways. But as we've seen, modern scholarship puts aside those prejudices and able to look at the story with new eyes, especially the eyes of women who have been victims of patriarchy and violence, but also people who've been victims of religious violence, violence in the name of God, as well as folks looking to the ecological aspects of the story with the emphasis on the well and the eye of water, the spring that becomes a well. So as we do that, I'd also like to begin, as we did last time, looking at how artistic images of these scenes have changed over time as well. And it's really an amazing scene. So I've gone back up to verse 7 because that's the part that scholars tend or painters tend to illustrate in their art. So let's look at this verse and then you envision it and then we'll look at some images. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. So you have to picture a number of things, don't you? What's an angel look like? Um, where is this scene by the spring of water in the wilderness, and what is Shur? And if you don't know those details, you just have to imagine it. So let's look at how four artists, interestingly, three from the 17th century. I'm not an art historian, and I don't know why this was so hot, such a hot image in the 17th century, but maybe you can provide something about that and put a comment on it below the video if you know something about that. But first is this image from Nicolas Poussin, and I don't see any spring of water there, do you? And that may be wilderness to a European, but it's certainly not the kind of wilderness we'd expect between Canaan and Egypt. But there we see the angel in the sky amongst the clouds, and is that how you picture an angel? Something that can float wearing flowing garments like that? Well, let's look at another one. This one simply from the painter known as Claude. This is from 1646, and I'm not sure why Hagar would need a spring of water if she's right by a lake or whatever that body of water is there. So European artists presenting this in their context, not even trying to put it in the original biblical context. And again, an angel with wings, and Hagar dressed like a little European girl, as you might expect there. So let's look at a third one, this one from the school of Rembrandt. And maybe you can see the pattern. This is from the late 1650s, so all three paintings from within a 15-year period, all portraying the angels relatively the same way with wings and with some kind of flowing garments, and this one more white. And the little Dutch girl at the angel's feet, hardly anybody's picture of an Egyptian. Last video, we noted that it's hard to identify an Egyptian visually in terms of ethnicity because Egypt then and now is made up of people from so many different historical cultural contexts, but probably not a little Dutch girl. And so that leads us to the last one here, the only one that actually takes seriously the cultural context at all, and this from James Tissot later in the late 19th century, 1896 to 1902. And although the angel is more or less the same, notice the angel's garments are not flowing there, they're tied together, perhaps more like the Tissot would understand a Bedouin or a desert dweller, and barefoot. And then Hagar as well, wrapped in a scarf or some kind of cloth to protect her from the desert wind and heat. And they're actually by an eye of water. It doesn't look like a well there. It looks like a natural spring that's just had rocks put around it. Although maybe it's ambiguous. Maybe it's the beginning of the story or the end of the story because the eye of water then becomes a well. So four different images to guide us into looking at this, and maybe you see it differently. But as we enter into this, we have to pay attention to a couple of things about angels. First, let's look at angels in Genesis. This is the first time we're seeing angels. And as we noted last time, the Hebrew word for angel is malach. It's only a vowel different from king, malach, and that comes across very importantly in the books of Samuel sequence, the time of year when kings or angels went into battle. That sets up the David and Bathsheba story, but that's literally for another sequence of scripture here. So when we see the angel here, it's the first time we're seeing one. And the word malach literally just means messenger. And so angel itself, the English word angel, comes from a transliteration of the Greek angelos, which also means messenger. So really, neither in Hebrew or Greek is there a word for something called an angel. There's simply a word for messenger, and some of those messengers are described as messengers of Yahweh or messengers of Elohim, rendered in most translations as God, as we can see on my chart here. So I put the angels of Yahweh ones in red and the angels of God or Elohim in purple, drawing attention as we see to the four uses of it, and I put it all in red here on the left side too, so you can really see how they're all bunched together. I didn't put that in the keywords chart because it's not really a word as such. I mean, it is a word, but it's an identification of a character, so I kept that separately. But note how tightly it connects this story with the story of Abraham in chapter 22, and that's part of the work we're going to look at. Um, as we look at Susan Piggott's work on Hagar and Abraham. Notice also the angel of God part here called to Hagar from heaven, but the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham at this point from heaven, and the angel of God called to Abraham a second time from heaven. So not only the angel of Yahweh here that connects, but the calling from heaven, both to Hagar and to Abraham there. So something that really connects that. And as many scholars have noted, angels in this time period, which is to say in the time period when Genesis was written, were not like what we saw on those paintings. So the images of angels with wings comes from apocalyptic references, and then that becomes manifest in Renaissance art. But the apocalyptic sense of angels as rebellious denizens of heaven who then try to infect humans, it comes from first Enoch and other traditions that are certainly later than Genesis. So as many scholars have noted, the messenger of Yahweh is really just interchangeable with Yahweh. It's a way of saying that somebody meets Yahweh face to face without engaging in some people's minds, blasphemous idea that you could talk to God face to face. And that will be something that she grapples with here, and it's certainly something that Moses grapples with. And Moses described as talking to God face to face in his tent, if not by the burning bush, the story in Exodus 3 that's in many ways parallel to this one. The angel here is important to recognize is not distinguished, does not look like anybody else. And when we see it in chapter 19 around the Sodom story, we'll see that what's described in 1915 as angels were earlier simply described as men on a sheen, and at one time as Yahweh. So they don't look like anything different. They seem to have a certain power. They can bring about a bright light that blinds the people of Sodom. But there's no description of them flying, and there's no description of them looking like anything other than human beings. And that's important to some of the story, that there's nothing startling about them. Here, in our immediate story, Hagar does not seem the slightest bit perturbed by this experience. She has this conversation, and sort of a conversation, as we'll see. The angel does most of the talking, but she responds, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai," rather than, "Who are you? What am I talking to?" Very different than Moses in the burning bush, where he comes across it and is startled by the bush. And then when he hears the voice, he's startled as well. But Hagar is not startled either by the presence of anything out there, any living thing, or this being that the narrator describes as angel of the Lord. As readers, we know that. Does she know what this being is or this voice speaking to her? We don't know. It never identifies itself directly. And yet she will identify it as God. Not in the name of Yahweh, as we'll see, but she will give a new name to God, the only woman to do so in this whole book. So, finds her by the spring of water. And the spring of water, as I noted previously when we looked at the key words, is literally an eye of water. And that's what we see here. But springs and wells are so often symbols of female fertility. And that should not surprise us very much, because a well that has life in it, that gives life to the earth, of course, and to people from the water in it, is very similar to a female womb that is filled with water, and of course life comes out of that. And so we saw in the Garden of Eden story not a spring of water, but a river of water that flowed up in the absence of rain and watered the ground. And that was parallel, as we discussed then, with the fertility of the woman before she's named Eve. We'll see a similar thing in chapter 18, where Sarai is told that she's going to be pregnant, and she's surprisingly not as concerned with the possible pregnancy as she is with the possibility of having vaginal moisture, given how old and dried up her husband is. So we'll see it's very logical and natural to have these springs of water pulling up out of the ground, or human-shaped ones like wells, be symbolic of pregnancy, or at least of courtship. And we'll see that well scene that we'll see in chapter 24 and in chapter 29, where Abram's servant goes out to the well and comes back with Rebekah, and then Jacob goes out to the well and comes back with Rachel and Leah, and the two Shipha, their maids, here are slave girls, but that's later in the story. So she found the spring of water in the wilderness. And again, the wilderness is something that Dozeman, and here he is again, I showed him last time, this article really helps us with. And that also helps us to see all these parallels between Hagar and Moses from Dozeman's piece here. So here, each encounters a messenger, an angel from Yahweh. That's one of the only other times that phrase is used is in Exodus 3:2. And then each is going to respond by fleeing and return to the oppressive situation, which we see here. And each will receive a word of promise and leaves the wilderness with a new name for God and a new role. And so all these parallels that make Hagar much like Moses, an amazing character to have this Egyptian slave girl made parallel to. And so the angel of the Lord speaks Hagar by name, something that neither Sarai or Abram would do. Again, we've noted this may or may not actually be a name. It can mean the immigrant or the alien, but it's the only name that Hagar has, and the messenger speaks it and describes her as slave girl of Sarai, of Shiphath Sarai, and asks a question that interestingly would be considered inappropriate, as Copeland notes from her piece on water and wells, that if there's a stranger coming up to visit in the middle of a desert situation, it would be inappropriate to ask where they came from or where they were going until you'd provided food and water them for 3 days, if they stayed that long, as to protect their privacy in case they were running away from oppression, or just to honor their need and not feel the power over them to demand they answer your questions. And so, as Copeland notes, the angel's question here is rude. It interrupts Hagar's peacefulness, and yet it's essential. And the where from question is the last question that Yahweh or a divine voice has spoken since spoken to the woman in the garden. Where are you? There they were hiding because they were guilty, but she's not guilty of anything. She's simply a victim. And so she said in her first and words in the story here, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. And the running away is parallel to Moses here in Exodus 2:15, and to the Israelites in 14:5. Notice that she refers also to Sarai in the same term that the narrator has earlier as a Gevira. So she's not denying Sarai's status over her, at least in the formal title. And then the angel of the Lord speaks again, and as Will Gaffney notes here, important to hear that writing as a black woman reading this story, I see God's return of Hagar to her servitude and abuse as the tendency of some religious communities to side with the abuser at the expense of the abused women and their children. And it really is a difficult thing here, what happens. But on the other hand, what else is there to do? Leaving Hagar out in the desert, and the desert it is, as we saw from Tissot's painting, would mean she'd probably be dead. Pregnant girl out there all by herself reminds you of another pregnant girl who travels all by herself, the mother of Jesus, Mary, in the Gospel of Luke. But she has a home to go to, and her kinswoman Elizabeth, and it's a lot farther to go to Egypt for Hagar here. So the angel of the Lord says to her, return to your mistress and submit. And older scholars like Westerman suggest that this is inconsistent with verse 11, but newer scholars highlight that those source-based inconsistencies can be ignored, and we can find ways to read the story consistently, and so we will. So let's go down a little bit to see a little more of the scene. Submit to her, literally be oppressed by her hand, and notice the hand imagery, as we saw last time. Abram said, your slave girl is in your hand, to Sarai. So submit to her hand. And as my note down below says, the shift from the PL of this word of Sarai's oppression to the Hitpael of the response the deity prescribes for Hagar could be interpreted as a specific endorsement of Sarai's harsh treatment, or as a reminder of the agency that Hagar has in inhabiting her apparently powerless situation. And this from Mabubi, who's a black Jewish writer, a rare person in that mode, and a leader of Jewish women of color. So reading it from that perspective. So what else would she do? And I'd like to suggest that this is part of a pattern we're going to see in Genesis, and we're going to see it much later also in chapter 34, that when characters make a decision that's bad, in the sense that it's coming out of what they see in their eyes rather than of God, they're faced with bad choices. So we saw already Lot made the bad choice of looking at the land that looked good in his eyes, and he was stuck and caught in a war, and it took his uncle Abraham or Abram to go rescue him, and he ended up going back to Sodom, and after that he ends up in a cave with his daughters, getting drunk and having sex with them. Not a good sequence for him. Later in chapter 34, we'll see that Jacob settles near a city when Yahweh had told him to go all the way home, and after that his daughter gets raped, and then the question is what to do in that situation, and the sons are faced with only bad choices. The bad choices we see here, either die in the desert or go back and submit to the oppression, are there because Sarai told Abram to go into the slave girl in the first place and didn't trust that Yahweh would provide the child that will be given in just a couple of chapters. So this whole mess is a function of Abram and Sarai refusing to listen to Yahweh and trust in Yahweh's promise. Ironically, just after chapter 15:6 had Yahweh crediting it to Abram as righteousness for trusting. So, scholars have noted the multiple repetitions of angel of the Lord here without any intervening comment from Hagar. And I've noted one way to read that is that these are excerpts from a longer speech. But another way to read it, as scholars often do here, is that Hagar's silent. Whether she's overwhelmed by this, although she made her statement here, or just doesn't know what to say, that in her silence, the angel of the Lord keeps speaking. So, on the second time here, following into our chiastic center, the angel of the Lord also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your offspring that they cannot be counted for multitude. And that's almost an exact parallel here with what we see with Abraham here in chapter 22, where the story's tightly connected there. And I'll just leave that up here so we can see the messenger of the Lord there and other things that Piggott helps us see are connected to that. Multiply your offspring, literally your seed, which is an unusual way to speak to a woman, but it's not any more unusual in telling offspring, Abraham, the offspring of his body, the issue of his body. So just as men don't give birth and women don't have seed, these words are used interchangeably for each element of the gender pairing there. And the phrase they cannot be counted for multitude. Curiously, the word for cannot be counted, sifr, is normally the noun for book or writing, but here it's in a verb form and has something to do with counting, although it's unclear that's exactly what it means. But certainly the context suggests that cannot be counted. And for the third time now, the angel of the Lord speaks. And says, now, after this bad news here, that return to your missus submit, you'll have great numbers of offspring, and you have conceived and shall bear a son. A different, slightly different word than we saw in verse 4 for conceived, which is why I don't have it highlighted here in the chart. And you shall call him Ishmael, the divine word giving a woman a name for her child. And we'll see the same thing with Sarah when she's told to name the child Yitzhak. And so you shall name him Ishmael, which has a weird irony here, which means El has heard, for Yahweh has heard your affliction. So an El name for something specifically connected, all these places with Yahweh, you think it would be Ishua or something like that. It has an Yahweh sequence, but that's not what we see here. And as Sarna notes below, it is noteworthy the image of Ishmael in the Bible, as distinct from later Jewish literature, is by and large not a negative one. And we're going to expand on that in just a moment to show how clear that is. So Yahweh has heard your affliction here, given heed or heard it. I want to highlight here, directly connecting to Exodus 3:7, that Yahweh has heard the cry of the Israelites, and he says this to Moses, just as he's going to point Moses to go back, just as Hagar is going back to be subjected. Moses will be subjected to Pharaoh again, along with the Israelites continuing to be subjected. So let's go down to our last elements here. And the New RSV has the classic bad interpretation of this. He shall be a wild ass of a man with his hand against everyone and everyone's hand against him, and he shall live at odds with all his kin. Which, from narrative context, seems very odd, doesn't it? That after this promise that you'll have many children and that God has heard you, why would the child be then cursed by Yahweh? And the reality is the child's not been cursed by Yahweh. The child's been cursed by translators who are on the side of Sarai and or side of Isaac and against Ishmael. So if we look over here, combining a couple of people's, Crayers and Piggott's, but there are also many others who have done this, we can hear different ranges of this. He will be a wild ass of a man. The word for wild ass here, pare, simply means a wild donkey, one that's not ever been domesticated. A species of that could be found in the Middle East is known as an onager. And so that could well be a compliment. As Crayer suggests, he shall be a free man. Another translator suggested he will be a wild Mustang, as opposed to wild ass. It's obviously the word ass that sounds negative in our ears. So he'll be a wild Mustang or a free man. The Norris V has with his hand against everyone. The Hebrew preposition ba, like just be with a short e sound, can mean a lot of things. It can mean against, but can also mean with or for or upon. So Crayer suggests his hand will be free from everyone. Piggott suggests his hand will be with everyone. So in other words, he could be independent or he could be part of a community. And the same flip side here, everyone's hand against him or everyone's hand will be free from him, which is to say he won't oppress anybody, and the hand of everyone with him, which is to say a symmetry here, his hand with everyone and everyone's hand with him. So he's part of community. And finally, he shall live at odds with all his kin, or he will live in the presence of all his kin. What a radical difference we hear from these modern translators, rendering this positive, which fits with the positive image of Hagar that we've seen throughout the whole scene. So I would suggest just throw out translations like this and adapt to one like this, especially since the incredible positive thing we see here just as the story comes to an end. Notice that her reply, as my note below says, seems totally to ignore the birth oracle, focusing simply on the numinous experience of God herself here. So in the cultural context, women may have status rise from becoming pregnant or being mothers, but she's more concerned with the experience of God than she is with becoming a mother. And perhaps that's like Mary in contrast with Martha. Not that Martha in Luke's gospel wanted to become a mother, but was busy about the things that the culture told her she was supposed to do. And Mary was happy to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen. And now Hagar is not exactly sitting at the feet of God, but in the presence of God, seeing and being seen. So here, she literally called the Yahweh who spoke to her, "You are El Roi, the God who sees me." And Sarna notes the marvelous ambiguity, his phrase, of the vocalization of Roy here. So all three of the following are possible. The God of seeing, which is to say the all-seeing God, or the God of my seeing, in other words, the God I have seen, or the God who sees me. And that's a beautiful thing about the biblical Hebrew, that it can be ambiguous in ways that lead us to hear it in all three of those ways and not to pick one or the other. So you're the God of seeing, for she said, and this can be translated differently too, as Grossman notes, have I not gone on seeing after he saw me? In other words, the fact that she's alive after seeing God is the miracle for her. And therefore now it's called a well. Ba'ir here, not beer like the beverage, Ba'ir like Beersheba, previously called an ayin. And note there's some interesting link there with the Gospel of John that uses, as the Septuagint does here, pege and frere for cistern and for springs. We won't get into the detail of that now. She called the well Bar Lahai Roy. It lies between Kadesh and Barad. And so we see that on the map here, all the way down here. This is where the well is. They're guessing on her way back to Egypt, where she will eventually get a son for Ishmael, but not until she goes back and submits to her giver Sarai. And so in the next scene, we'll look at the very end of this, and we'll see how this transitions into God speaking directly to Abraham one more time. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.